My name is Evelyn Bennett, and I was 36 years old when the last piece of this finally fell into place. 9 minutes after a judge finalized my divorce, I stepped outside the courthouse, called my father, and said the sentence I had been holding inside for 15 months. Fire all 27 employees my in-laws planted in your company. My dad went silent. I could hear him breathing, but for several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked me the one question I had spent years hoping he would finally ask. What do you need me to do? I had imagined that phone call so many times that I thought it would be the hardest moment of the day. It was not. By that evening, my former mother-in-law was pounding on the door of my apartment hard enough for everyone on the floor to hear. She screamed that I was vindictive, unstable, and ungrateful. When rage failed to move me, she changed tactics. Her voice softened. Her posture relaxed, and she offered me something far more dangerous than anger. A quiet solution. What she did not know was that I had already found the empty shelf, and once I found it, the quiet version of my life was over. To understand how 27 people entered my father's company without anyone stopping them, you first need to understand my father and the business he built with his own hands. Dad started Bennett Mechanical in 1992 with a used welding rig, a battered truck that needed prayer to start in the winter, and more confidence than cash. By the time I reached high school, the company had a real building in Grove City, Ohio. The shop smelled like welding flux, hot steel, machine oil, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner since sunrise. I did homework in the break room and learned early that a business was not an abstract thing. It was people, paychecks, families, and promises. I also learned that my father would sign almost anything if the person sliding it across the table seemed honest. Dad could evaluate a weld by looking at it from 10 feet away, but a friendly salesman with a firm handshake could get him to sign a contract before reading page 2. Somebody in the family had to study the fine print, and that somebody became me. I put myself through law school using scholarships and night shifts at a title agency. I never took money from Bennett Mechanical for tuition, rent, or books. I wanted to know I had earned my place. When I eventually joined as general counsel and compliance officer, I treated my badge the same way the welders treated theirs. It meant I was responsible for protecting the company, even when protection was uncomfortable. By 2026, Bennett Mechanical employed 212 people. 212 families, he would say. He knew every employee's name, many of their children's names, and who was going through a difficult season. I managed contracts, investigated risk, organized records by year and category, reviewed vendor agreements, and generally became the least entertaining person in every leadership meeting. Dad joked that I read warranty cards for pleasure. He was not entirely wrong. People appreciate carefulness until the risk is sitting beside them at Thanksgiving dinner. The first Holloway hire looked like a favor. I met Adrian Holloway in 2016 at a hospital charity gala chaired by his mother, Victoria. Adrian was 28 when I met him. By the time everything ended, he was 38. But that night, he had the kind of polished charm that never looked like effort. He remembered my coffee order and made my carefulness feel admirable instead of excessive. When he brought me to the Holloway home that fall, I understood that I was being presented to the family the way someone presents a promising business proposal. The house was impressive from the street, all white trim and old trees. Up close, my occupational instincts took over. The window frames were soft with rot beneath fresh paint. I did not yet have the phrase, old money without money, but I recognized the feeling. Victoria Holloway greeted me at the door, wearing pearls at 4 in the afternoon. She was charming in a way that felt less like hospitality and more like being carefully handled. She knew every powerful person in the county, along with their spouses and children. During dinner, she asked what I did. I told her I managed contracts and compliance for my father's mechanical contracting company. Victoria placed her fork beside her plate, looked at me as though I had just passed an examination I did not know I was taking, and said, "Practical. That is exactly what this family needs." I laughed too because it sounded like praise. It took me 9 years to realize it was a job offer, except I was not being hired. I was the acquisition. Adrian proposed the following spring at a restaurant his mother selected. I said yes with my entire heart. And if I could change only one detail in my life, it might be that. We married in 2017 inches front of 200 guests, most of whom I had never met. During the reception, Victoria stood with a champagne glass and ended her toast with the sentence that would follow me for nearly a decade. Family takes care of family. The room applauded. My father wiped tears from his eyes. I squeezed Adrian's hand and thought I was the luckiest woman in Franklin County. 6 weeks later, Victoria called me directly about Adrian's cousin Nolan, who was between opportunities and, according to her, unusually good with numbers. Purchasing had an opening. I forwarded Nolan's resume with a note disclosing the family connection, and I felt responsible for making the disclosure. He interviewed adequately, received an offer, and I signed his onboarding packet myself. I thought our families were knitting together. I still think about that signature. I remember it with the nausea of watching an earlier version of yourself hold open the door. Nolan was punctual, polite, and completely unremarkable. He did nothing impressive and nothing alarming. Later, I understood that was the point. The first person was a test balloon. Nobody attaches the real cargo to the first balloon. That Christmas, Victoria gave my father a bottle of scotch older than I was and told him Bennett Mechanical represented the kind of American success story her family was proud to join. Dad glowed. I glowed. Years later, I calculated that the bottle cost roughly 1/1000th of what that sentence would eventually earn her family. Between 2019 and 2021, Bennett Mechanical expanded quickly. We added municipal contracts, opened new divisions, and hired aggressively to keep pace. Inside that growth, a faint pattern appeared. A scheduling clerk was Victoria's goddaughter. An accounts payable associate was the daughter of a woman who played tennis with Victoria every Tuesday. An estimator arrived through Adrian's professional network, although Adrian's network seemed to consist almost entirely of people his mother had introduced to him. Each resume was thin but technically acceptable. Each interview went well enough. Every hire moved through our new human resources director, Denise Carver, who had joined us after receiving a glowing recommendation from Victoria. Our previous HR manager had retired abruptly, with a generous package no one clearly remembered approving. I raised the issue during a meeting. I said the concentration of related referrals was becoming unusually high and suggested we strengthen the conflict of interest policy. Denise laughed gently, the way an adult laughs at a child who is frightened of a shadow. Evelyn reads warranty cards for fun, she said. The room chuckled because that was my reputation. That reputation made me easy to dismiss. I did not simply let it go. I wrote a memorandum, updated the disclosure form, and required every new employee to sign it. At the time, it felt administrative and weak. Years later, those signatures would matter enormously. A disclosure form cannot stop a scheme, but it can matter when the crash comes. By the summer of 2021, I had identified 11 hires with direct Holloway connections. I was about to learn how the number would reach 27. In September 2021, my father suffered a heart attack on the shop floor. He was 60 years old. He collapsed between two rows of pipe stock, and a 23-year-old apprentice performed chest compressions until the ambulance arrived. Dad survived. He underwent triple bypass surgery and remained away from the company for 8 months. The building noticed his absence, and so did the people waiting for an opening. That autumn, I spent my days driving between the hospital in Columbus and the office in Grove City. I chose my father's heartbeat over the organizational chart. While I was choosing him, Adrian's younger brother, Colin, volunteered to help temporarily. Colin was 34, and I never identified his previous job. Temporary help became a desk. The desk became an office. The office became the title of operations director. Adrian had already joined Bennett Mechanical 2 years earlier as vice president of client relations, a role Victoria somehow negotiated into existence during a dinner I had not attended. While Dad recovered, Adrian introduced Colin to our municipal contacts and spoke about him as though he had always belonged there. The hiring accelerated at the exact moment I had the least capacity to fight it. 16 additional people joined during those 8 months. Denise processed every file. When Dad finally returned, he was thinner, slower, and newly allergic to conflict. He studied the new organizational chart and said it was good to see so much fresh energy in the company. I looked at the same chart and saw a transplant the body had never approved. I spoke to him privately, gently, with the office door closed. I explained that the referrals were concentrated in purchasing, accounts payable, estimating, human resources, and operations. Those departments controlled vendors, invoices, receiving, and records. Dad lifted one tired hand and stopped me. That was the first time he said the sentence that would govern the next 5 years of my life. You do not fire family. He was not angry. He was certain, the way he was certain about weld temperatures, payroll on Fridays, and the value of a person's handshake. I did not yet have evidence of theft. I had a pattern, a map, and a feeling. They were not enough to break through a principle he considered sacred. One night in late 2023, I could not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and drew the company from memory. I listed every employee hired since my wedding, every referral, every reporting relationship, and every department where the Holloways had influence. Then I took a red pen and circled each person connected to Victoria by blood, marriage, friendship, tennis, or one of the social networks she called family when it suited her. When I finished, I counted the circles twice because the number looked impossible. 27 people. 27 people sat in the departments through which money entered, moved, and left. That was not ordinary nepotism. It was infrastructure. I brought the legal pad to my father the next morning. He studied it for a long time, and I saw something flicker across his face. Dad is not a foolish man. He is a loyal man, and those are different vulnerabilities. He slid the pad back to me and said, "They are good people, Evie. Victoria's people are good people. You do not fire family." I took the pad back to my office and did everything I could without the owner's signature. I lowered purchasing approval thresholds. I required dual authorization for new vendors. I added access logs to sensitive records and made sure my own credentials could review every purchasing transaction. I was stacking sandbags while everyone insisted the sky was clear. 2 months later, I found purchase order 7,734, and nothing in my life was quiet again. It was January 2024, and I was doing one of the least dramatic tasks imaginable, comparing quarterly material expenses with commodity indexes. Copper prices had fallen that quarter. Our copper costs had not. I ran the figures 3 times, assuming I had made a mistake. Then I pulled 2 years of invoices from a supplier called Northgate Industrial Supply, LLC. Bennett Mechanical was paying an average of 22% above market. 22% on a category that large was a second house every year. A bad price is not automatically fraud. It can result from lazy purchasing, an old agreement no one rebid, freight surcharges, or a relationship that outlived its usefulness. I searched the vendor records. Northgate Industrial Supply had been formed 5 years earlier. It entered our approved vendor system in 2021. During Dad's recovery, with one authorizing signature, Colin Holloway. The company claimed to distribute industrial pipe and fittings, but its address was a suite in a Westerville office park. A pipe distributor operating from a small office suite deserved questions. The listed agent was Russell Mercer, a name I did not recognize at the time. Northgate's website contained 3 pages of vague language and stock photographs. One image showed a warehouse with another company's forklift watermark still visible in the corner. I sat with those facts for an entire evening. I did not confront Colin, call Victoria, or storm into my father's office. I had already watched adults turn my diligence into a joke. This time, I intended to count every brick before using the word wall. I began printing invoices. For 3 weeks, my dining table stopped functioning as a dining table. I arranged records by quarter, taped index cards to the wall, and ate standing at the kitchen counter like a raccoon wearing a respectable cardigan. Adrian traveled frequently that winter for client relations, or at least that was the explanation. Most nights, it was me, a highlighter, and a growing coldness in my stomach. The documents showed a deliberate pattern. Northgate's prices rose in small, polite increments. No single increase looked dramatic enough to trigger a review. Purchase orders repeatedly landed just below the second signature threshold. Someone had studied my controls. Certain orders repeated at regular intervals, with identical quantities and line items, like a mechanical heartbeat. The largest purchases were attached to materials I could not connect to any active project. Copper fittings appeared for jobs that did not exist. I compared the invoices with receiving logs. The paperwork looked complete. Each shipment had dates, initials, warehouse locations, and signatures. The records began to look staged. My rule became: verify. Do not assume. For every irregularity, I wrote down an innocent explanation beside the guilty one. I discarded anything ordinary incompetence could explain. I kept only the items where innocence required more imagination than fraud. By February, I had a stack of those. The question was no longer whether money was leaving the company improperly. The question was who was carrying the bucket, and I was married into the answer. I asked Adrian about Northgate over dinner on a Tuesday night. I cooked his favorite meal, hoping a safe room might help the truth arrive. I found something strange, I said. Do you know anything about Northgate Industrial Supply? Their prices are high, and there is almost nothing behind the company. Adrian's fork stopped for half a second. If you have never watched someone you love pause for half a second before answering a simple question, I do not recommend it. Then he gave me the smooth smile he used at galas and said, Mom knows the owner. It is fine, Evie. They are solid people. Which owner? I asked. The filing's name Russell Mercer, and we are overpaying by 6 figures a year. Adrian placed his fork down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face. It was the patience of someone who had rehearsed how to manage me. You do this, he said softly. You take a spreadsheet and turn it into a story. Your dad's company is fine. Everyone is fine. Can we have one dinner that is not an audit? We did not shout or walk out. We discussed his sister's children and a vacation we would never take. Then we loaded the dishwasher side by side like two employees maintaining a marriage after business hours. Still, something ended during that half-second pause. We both knew it before either of us admitted it. Adrian knew about Northgate. He had always known. When forced to choose between telling me the truth and managing my reaction, he chose management, his mother's native language. In March 2024, I brought my father a one-page summary and a comparison simple enough for a child to understand. One column showed the market price of copper. The other showed what Bennett Mechanical paid Northgate. Dad read it twice. For 1 minute, I saw the father who once expelled a supplier for padding a fuel surcharge. Then his jaw tightened. He told me he would look into it quietly. I made the mistake of believing that sentence meant what the words said. I can reconstruct what happened next almost to the minute. I left Dad's office at 11:40 that morning. At 6:15 that evening, Victoria Holloway appeared at my parents' house carrying a lasagna. She arrived unannounced, something she had not done in 4 months. Only 2 places contained a record of my meeting with Dad: his calendar and Denise Carver's office. You can do the same arithmetic I did. My mother described the dinner later, while apologizing for not recognizing what Victoria was doing. Victoria dabbed at her eyes and spoke about how hard I had been working. She said I placed too much pressure on myself, that I cared so deeply I sometimes saw ghosts in numbers. She never mentioned Northgate. She did not need to. She was not challenging my evidence. She was changing my category. In one evening, she turned me from a lawyer into a worried daughter, from a compliance officer into an exhausted wife. It was an elegant maneuver, because objecting to it only made the diagnosis seem accurate. By the weekend, my father was patting my hand and suggesting I take time away from work. The quiet investigation never occurred. On Monday, after 9 years in my own family's company, I received a meeting invitation from Human Resources with no subject line. 3 employees had submitted complaints against me. Denise used the word pattern, perhaps because she had learned how powerful it sounded when I used it. She described a pattern of hostile, accusatory conduct that created an uncomfortable workplace. All 3 complainants were among the 27 names on my legal pad. One was a man I had spoken to exactly twice, and one of those conversations concerned a parking space. Denise slid a memorandum across the table with the practiced sympathy of someone preparing to put down a family pet. It was suggested In the passive voice, where so much corporate violence hides, that I work remotely while the complaints were reviewed. My badge technically remained active. My name technically remained on the compliance policies. In practice, I was removed from the building while Colin controlled operations, and Denise controlled the investigation into me. My father called and said perhaps some distance would be healthy until everyone calmed down. I do not describe him as a coward. He was a 62-year-old man with a rebuilt heart, a company he loved, and two competing realities placed in front of him every day. One reality came with documents and conflict. The other came with lasagna. I sat alone in my car in the parking lot and allowed myself one unprofessional minute. Then I drove to an office supply store and purchased 6 plastic file boxes. If they intended to limit my access to the system, I would preserve every record I was legally entitled to retain. Before leaving the building, however, I had one more place to check. Bay 12. Purchase order 7,734, documented $84,000 in copper fittings, supposedly delivered the previous October. The receiving log showed that the shipment had been unloaded and stored on the third shelf in Bay 12. On my final afternoon in the building, I walked through the warehouse with a clipboard, looking like I was taking inventory and feeling like I was robbing my own bank. Bay 12 sat near the rear of the warehouse, beyond racks of strut, pallets of hardware, and rolls of duct liner. The steel shelving unit rose almost to the ceiling. According to the records, $84,000 in copper fittings should have occupied the third level. I stood in front of it for a long time. The shelf was empty. It had not been cleared recently. A smooth gray layer of dust covered it. There were no drag marks, no rectangular clean patches where pallets had rested, no forklift scuffs on the concrete below, and no disturbed areas around the uprights. Whatever the receiving log claimed had been delivered, unloaded, and stored. There had never touched that shelf. I photographed everything. I took a wide image showing the entire bay, a close image of the dust, another showing the stenciled Bay 12 number, and several angles that captured the floor beneath it. I preserved timestamps on every file. One shelf contained more truth than all my memoranda. Paper can be explained away, and numbers recategorized as anxiety. Dust is harder to persuade. Standing under the cold warehouse lights, I finally understood that I was not paranoid and had never been paranoid. I emailed the photographs to my personal address, copied my attorney, and walked out through the guard shack smiling at everyone. Remember that empty shelf? We will return to it. I gave my husband one final door, and I wanted to know, for myself if no one else, that I had held it open with both hands. It was a Sunday in early March 2025, nearly a year after Victoria's lasagna visit. I placed the Bay 12 photographs on our kitchen island beside the Northgate comparison and said, "Stand with me. We take this to my father together. Whatever your family has done, you separate yourself from it today, and we deal with the consequences as a team." Adrian looked at the photographs for a long time. Then, the man who had remembered my coffee order after one date said, "You are asking me to choose against my mother. Family takes care of family, Evie." Victoria's wedding toast returned 9 years later through her son's mouth. At last I heard the sentence accurately. It had never been a promise of shelter. It was a claim of ownership. It defined family as a ledger, with usefulness where love belonged. I occupied the wrong side of that ledger. Adrian did too, although he would never admit it. I answered with a steadiness that surprised both of us. Okay. That was all I said. I had finally reached the place where my spine lived. I filed for divorce on Thursday, the 13th of March 2025, at the Franklin County Courthouse. The clerk had kind eyes, a cold, and wished me a pleasant weekend. Loss number 1 became official that day: my marriage. It had ended a year earlier, but now it had a case number. I did not know that filing for divorce had also started a clock I could not yet see. My divorce attorney was Sabrina Cole. She was 44, billed like a surgeon, and spoke with the same economy. During our first serious strategy meeting, she took away the only weapon I believed I had. "From this moment, until the decree is final, you touch nothing at Bennett Mechanical," she told me. No terminations, no canceled vendors, no fraud memorandum, no dramatic confrontation, nothing. I laughed because I had the shelf photographs and 6 boxes of records. Sabrina did not smile. Listen as though this is a jury instruction, she said. Adrian's attorneys will argue that the company's growth during the marriage creates a marital interest. Your name appears throughout its compliance history. The moment you begin firing his relatives or canceling vendors, you stop looking like a whistleblower and start looking like a vindictive spouse, damaging an asset to reduce his settlement. Every accurate statement you make afterward will be interpreted as strategy. They will bury your evidence inside your motive. I hated her because she was right. Everything I did could be true and still become unbelievable. The scheme was no longer protected only by my father's loyalty, it was protected by my divorce. If I acted too soon, I could lose the company while trying to save it. There is a lesson in that for anyone who has ever been called weak or irrational for waiting. Sometimes the most aggressive move looks like stillness. I asked Sabrina what I was allowed to do. For the first time that day, she smiled. And I understood why opposing counsel feared her. Prepare, she said, quietly, legally, and completely. When the clock runs out, be finished already. The Holloways stretched the divorce across 15 months. At first, I assumed the delays were spiteful. Their side requested 2 continuances, changed attorneys halfway through, and forced schedules to reset. Settlement conferences became arguments over furniture. I let them take their time because I was using every day they gave me. I hired a forensic accountant named Annika in Cincinnati and paid her $35,000 from my personal savings. The money had been intended for a home, so I used it to investigate the life I was leaving. At night and on weekends, Annika and I reconstructed 5 years of Northgate activity. Martin Keene, my father's controller of 22 years, became the first person inside the company to say plainly that he believed me. He walked us through authorized ledger exports and looked terrified doing it. We traced invoices, purchase orders, project numbers, receiving logs, vendor changes, approvals, and payment schedules. We found duplicate quantities, materials charged to non-existent work, and delivery records bearing the same compact initials. Anika's workbook grew to 9 tabs and a summary number that quieted us both. During that work, I reopened the Northgate Master Supply Agreement. It had lived in my own contract archive for years. Buried inside the standard language was an automatic renewal clause. The agreement ran for 5 years and renewed for another 5, unless written notice was delivered at least 30 days before expiration. I checked the dates twice and watched my wall of index cards become a countdown. Bennett Mechanical had to cancel in late June 2026. If it missed that window, the company would remain bound to Northgate until 2031. 5 more years of losses hid inside my department's boilerplate. The divorce was scheduled to conclude in the middle of June. Once I saw the renewal deadline, the previous 15 months looked different. I mapped every procedural delay in the divorce against the contract calendar. The first continuance followed disclosures revealing the scope of my records. The change of counsel, which reset discovery by 90 days, eliminated the period when I might have pushed for an early resolution. Each delay moved the finish line closer to one narrow section of late June. The decree was now expected roughly 48 hours before the final legal day to cancel Northgate. The Holloways were not merely punishing me, bargaining for money, or dragging out the marriage because they enjoyed control. They were running out a commercial clock. While the divorce remained open, Sabrina's freeze prevented me from taking action that could be portrayed as sabotage. If the decree arrived 2 days before the renewal deadline, they were betting that a newly divorced woman, financially exhausted and emotionally depleted, would go home, collapse, and miss the window. It was a reasonable bet, and it would have worked on almost anyone. I called Sabrina and explained the clause. She was silent for several seconds. Then she said, "We do not lose a single day. And Evelyn, they expect you to be tired." I looked at the wall of index cards, with the Bay 12 photograph taped in the center, and felt something I had not felt in years. It was not hope. It was a schedule. They thought they were consuming my time. They had no idea I had synchronized my watch to theirs. Anika delivered her final report in April 2026. It was 81 spiral-bound pages. In the formal language of forensic accounting, it confirmed what I had been trying to say in the language of a daughter and wife. Across 5 years, Northgate Industrial Supply had collected approximately $1.9 million through inflated pricing and purchases for materials that could not be tied to actual projects or inventory. I read the number while standing, sat down, and read it again. The report followed the money from Bennett Mechanical to Northgate, then from Northgate into a management services entity. The registered agent for that entity was Russell Mercer, the same name I had first encountered on the vendor's thin corporate filing. Anika's appendix uncovered the relationship my kitchen table research had missed. Russell Mercer of Shaker Heights was Victoria Holloway's first cousin. He appeared in her mother's 1989 obituary as a beloved nephew. Adrian had told me his mother knew the owner. He had offered that statement as reassurance because he believed the relationship made the vendor safe. In reality, it was the center of the scheme. I wish I could say I felt triumphant. I did not. Finding proof felt like locating rot inside a wall. Relief followed by nausea because the wall now had to be opened. My in-laws had built a straw through the middle of my father's company and drawn money through it for 5 years. They attended our holidays, sent Christmas cards, praised my father's integrity, and signed paperwork for copper that never existed. The initials on the receiving records belonged to Colin Holloway, the temporary volunteer who had become operations director. I closed Anika's report, squared its edges against the table because that is what I do when I need my hands to behave, and wrote one sentence in pencil across the cover. Nobody sees this until the decree. 39 days remained. Anyone who has warned their family about a charming person and then watched that warning get dismissed will recognize the loneliness of that moment. By then, however, loneliness was no longer enough to make me retreat. The next decision was about what I was willing to surrender in exchange for the freedom to act. 5 weeks before trial, Victoria made her largest move. It arrived disguised as peace. Adrian's attorney proposed a family mediation, not a formal legal session but an emotional gathering built around tea, reconciliation, and Victoria's supervision. Folded inside the invitation was the real offer. The Holloways would abandon their demand to revalue Bennett Mechanical as a marital asset if I signed a comprehensive confidentiality agreement covering family and business matters. The proposal was simple once translated. They would stop pretending they deserved a share of my father's company if I promised never to explain why they did not. Sabrina identified it immediately. "They know you have something," she said. A thread had become visible in discovery. Perhaps a subpoena approached Northgate too closely. Perhaps a deposition question produced an objection, a fraction too quickly. They knew there was evidence, and rather than panic, they assigned it a price. By then, I understood Victoria's world. Everything could be negotiated, including facts. Every scandal had a settlement value. Every betrayal was an invoice waiting for the right recipient. She believed I would accept because she had studied me accurately. I was Evelyn, the person who kept every piece handed to her, signed the welcome packets, softened the conflict, and absorbed pain privately so everyone else could continue dinner. Of course I would exchange an ugly truth for a clean exit. That was what the old Evelyn did. I instructed Sabrina to decline without a counteroffer. Her email contained only 2 useful sentences. Declined. They just learned something about you, so expect the volume to increase. It did. Through my mother, I heard that Victoria was telling friends I had suffered a breakdown and intended to destroy both families during the divorce. The county's social circuit followed her weather, and my forecast became pity with a chance of contempt. That was when I broke half of my own rule. The legal freeze prevented me from acting at the company, but nothing prevented me from sitting at my parents' kitchen table. On Memorial Day weekend in 2026, while my mother carried a casserole to a church event, I placed Anika's report in front of my father and said nothing. He read for 40 minutes. Dad moves his lips slightly through dense legal language, a habit I have always loved. Somewhere near the appendix containing the receiving logs, his lips stopped moving, his hands stilled, and his shoulders lowered. I watched a man observe the autopsy of 5 years of trust. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were wet. What he said hurt more cleanly than anything Victoria had ever done. You do not fire family. This time, the sentence was smaller. It was no longer a law. It sounded like a question from a man realizing that the principle he used to define decency had been picked up and used against him as a crowbar. No, Dad, I said, taking his hand across the table. You do not. But someone changed the meaning of family while we were not looking. I need you to trust me about what happens next. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he asked, What do you need from me, Evie? I had waited my entire adult life for that question. A phone call, I told him. 3 weeks from now, when I say now, you act. The night before the final settlement conference, I sat alone in my apartment with cold tea and every part of the plan arranged around me. Anika's report was backed up in multiple locations. The Northgate cancellation letter had been drafted. Martin had organized the internal files. The labor attorney had prepared the termination process. My father was ready to move when I gave the signal, and despite all that preparation, I caught myself designing the quiet version. You probably know the quiet version. In it, I would give the report to Dad and let him dismiss the 27 employees with severance, polite handshakes, and no public explanation. Northgate would end through a carefully negotiated letter. We would avoid the police, the press, the clients, and the bonding company. No one outside the family would know how close Bennett Mechanical came to being hollowed out. I would fix the damage without requiring anyone to admit that I had been right. I had been creating quiet versions of disasters my entire life. Over-responsible daughters do that. We process the poison privately and call it strength. We protect everyone from the scene, even when the scene is the only thing capable of stopping the harm. Sitting with that cold tea, I finally calculated what my silence had purchased. 15 years of smoothing conflict had given the Holloways access, time, cover, and $1.9 million. My silence had never protected my family. It had protected the scheme. I said those words aloud in the empty apartment. The sentence felt like setting down an object I had carried so long that its weight had become my posture. If the truth remained manageable, it could remain deniable. It needed to cost something in daylight, and part of that cost would belong to me. I would lose privacy, money, and the reputation I had spent years building as the reasonable person in every room. At 1:14 inches the morning, I texted Sabrina. Take the deal to the mat. I am finished being the quiet one. She replied at exactly 6. About time. Here is what I traded, including the actual numbers, because this is the point where people often assume I had an easy financial escape waiting for me. Adrian and I owned a house in Upper Arlington that sold during the divorce for $640,000. My share should have been close to $320,000. There were retirement accounts to divide, a possible spousal support claim, and continuing threats from Adrian's attorneys to seek a marital valuation of Bennett Mechanical based on its growth during our marriage. At the final settlement conference in early June, Sabrina placed one package on the table. I would accept $40,000 from the house proceeds, waive support, and surrender the retirement split. In exchange, every Holloway, named individually and through any related entity, would permanently release every claim, interest, valuation, demand, or ownership argument involving Bennett Mechanical and its assets. Sabrina drafted the clause tightly enough to cover Adrian, Victoria, Colin, Russell Mercer, Northgate, and any affiliated individual or entity, known or unknown. Their attorneys read it, and I watched the calculation pass through the room. They believed I was paying them to leave me alone. They saw a tired former wife sacrificing more than $250,000 to secure a clean break. They did not understand that I was purchasing unrestricted control of the next 48 hours. Their side signed so quickly that the notary asked them to slow down. Before I added my initials, Sabrina looked at me one final time. You understand that you are paying them to release your father's company, she asked. Every dollar, I said. Then I signed. The old life disappeared in blue ink. The house money, the retirement security, the soft landing, and the option of pretending none of it had happened were gone by my own decision. People imagine the point of no return as something forced upon them. Sometimes you buy it. On the 16th of June, 2026, the final hearing lasted 11 minutes. That is an insulting amount of time to end a 9-year marriage. Although I have learned to appreciate the efficiency. At 9:31 inches the morning, the judge signed the decree. My marriage ended. The releases became enforceable. Sabrina's 15-month restraint dissolved. Adrian did not look at me in the hallway. Victoria did not attend because she considered courthouses vulgar, which was a luxurious opinion for someone whose plans depended so heavily on legal paperwork. I walked into ordinary June sunlight and stood beside a bronze statue outside the courthouse. Then I checked my watch. I had synchronized it, literally, with the contract deadline taped to my apartment wall. We had approximately 47 hours left to stop Northgate from renewing for another 5 years. They expected me to go home and exhale. Instead, at 9:49 minutes after the divorce became final, I called my father. "Dad, it is done," I said. "Now, fire all 27. Martin has the records. The labor attorney has the letters. Security has been briefed. Denise goes first before she can alter one file." Silence followed. Inside it, I could almost hear 34 years of "you do not fire family" being lowered carefully onto a workbench because the tool no longer fit the job. "I already have my boots on," Dad said. He was 64 years old and sounded 20. I laughed on the courthouse steps in a gray dress, newly divorced, financially stripped down, holding a phone in one hand and 47 hours in the other. I had waited 15 months to make that call. What I had not anticipated was who would be at my apartment before dinner. I did not attend the terminations. Sabrina advised me to let the owner make the decision and allow counsel to execute it without my presence. It needed to look exactly like what it was: a documented corporate response, not a former wife settling family scores. Martin called that evening and narrated the day with the excitement of a man who had spent 22 years waiting to become the interesting person at dinner. At 11 in the morning, Dad, the labor attorney, and a note-taker assembled in the small conference room. They conducted 27 meetings, each scheduled for 10 minutes. Every file contained documentation, signed disclosures, and a termination letter. The process was intentionally dull. No shouting, no public escort, no dramatic speeches. The reason was stated plainly: undisclosed conflicts of interest and participation in related party transactions that violated company policy. Employment ended immediately. Where severance was offered, it came with conditions reviewed by counsel. Badges and company property were collected at the door. Denise Carver went first, so she could not enter a personnel file or contact the other employees through company systems. According to Martin, she said almost nothing. Her silence disturbed me more than anger would have. Professionals do not always argue when a plan fails. Sometimes they simply decide whom to call. Colin argued enough for several people. First, he demanded Dad's loyalty. Then he demanded gratitude for everything he had done during the heart attack recovery. Finally, while losing control of the conversation, he cited his own initials on the receiving logs as proof that he had performed his job properly. The labor attorney wrote that statement down very slowly while Colin watched. On his way out, Colin kicked a trash can. Of all the events that followed, the trash can became Dad's favorite detail. He still described it with the delight of a child recounting a foul ball he caught at a game. By 4 in the afternoon, the process was complete. 27 desks were empty. Security collected badges with the calm courtesy of a hotel checkout. Adrian never appeared. At 4:20, I received the only message he sent me that year. "You could have done this quietly." I read it twice, placed the phone face down, and answered the empty kitchen. Yes, that was the problem. I was still standing there when the pounding began. It was hard, flat-palmed, and urgent. Not the measured knock of law enforcement, but the furious knock of family. Victoria Holloway had never visited my apartment. Visiting would have required her to acknowledge the apartment existed, which would have meant acknowledging the divorce, the 14 months I had lived away from the Upper Arlington house, and the failure of the merger she believed my marriage represented. My address appeared in the court filings, however, and at 7 that evening, I saw her through the peephole, wearing pearls and a wool coat in June, one fist raised toward my door. I opened it because a scene like that rarely arrives twice. Victoria entered without waiting for an invitation. 27 people, Evelyn, she said, her voice filling the apartment. She called me unstable, vindictive, and ungrateful. She spoke of innocent families, mortgages, children, and Christmas, even though it was June. She demanded to know what people would say and whether I had considered my father's reputation before dragging his company through public disgrace. I remained beside the bookshelf and let the words strike the room around me. 2 years earlier, Victoria's voice could reorganize my nervous system. That night, it was only weather against glass. Then she studied me and changed instruments, her volume lowered, her chin softened. She sat on my sofa without permission, smoothed the front of her coat, and became warm in a single practiced motion. Evelyn, sweetheart, everyone is exhausted. Let me offer you something reasonable. The same bargain had returned in evening clothes. She proposed that Bennett Mechanical rehire the 15 genuinely innocent employees. The phrase betrayed more than she intended. If 15 were genuinely innocent, then 12 were not, at least by her own arithmetic. In exchange, she wanted mutual confidentiality. Nothing would be filed publicly. No clients would be informed. No one would have to know. My father could preserve his name, and I could preserve mine. You are so good at keeping everything smooth, she told me. It is the best thing about you. There it was. She appraised the need that had controlled me for years and offered it back as praise. Victoria had always understood exactly what I was made of and exactly how to use it. She was presenting the quiet version, gift-wrapped. A year earlier, I might have accepted. I looked at her for a long moment and asked the question I had been saving since I finally understood her. Who signed your welcome packet? She became completely still. For 1 second, the only second I ever witnessed, Victoria Holloway stopped performing. Finally, she said, my mother owned a flower shop on Lee Road, Mercer's Flowers. Her voice contained a roughness I had never heard. When Victoria married into the Holloway family, her father-in-law's debts were, as she carefully phrased it, considerable. Her mother's shop had been used as collateral, without her mother fully understanding the arrangement. She learned what had happened at Thanksgiving. Then she set the table anyway. Victoria smoothed her coat, and the roughness disappeared beneath the polished surface. I learned young that a woman in families like these is either useful or she is furniture, she said. I have spent 40 years being useful. I made certain my sons married useful women. That is not cruelty, Evelyn. That is how the world works. Family takes care of family. The toast, the password, and the entire belief system stood naked in front of me. To Victoria, love was a supply chain, and marriage was procurement. Her mother's flower shop had become collateral decades earlier, and instead of rejecting the system, Victoria mastered it. She had once been close enough to exploitation to recognize it, then spent the rest of her life becoming the person who decided who would be used next. The debt from that flower shop seemed to travel forward through 4 decades until it reached my father's warehouse. Victoria was both the collector and, long ago, the collateral. For a moment, I nearly pitied her. The feeling was real, and I will not pretend otherwise. Had she stopped speaking then, perhaps I would remember the night differently. She did not. Victoria stood, gathered her coat, and delivered the line she had likely composed in the car. Sign the agreement, dear. If this becomes public, Bennett will become a punchline at every table from here to Cleveland. Think of your father's heart. God forbid the stress causes something. Consider what you are choosing. Then she left quietly, confident that fear and arithmetic would finish the work for her. I stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes. Then I picked up my phone and confirmed the 8 o'clock meeting scheduled for the following morning, the meeting Victoria knew nothing about. 38 hours remained before the Northgate deadline. The second-floor conference room at Bennett, mechanical seats, 12 people, and had never before needed all 12 chairs. At 8 in the morning on June 17, it held 2 representatives from our bonding company, 3 executives from Westbridge Health Group, the healthcare construction client responsible for roughly 30% of our revenue, my father, Martin, and me. Sabrina had reviewed the options with me one final time the night before, and I understood the fork in the road clearly. No law required that meeting. We could terminate Northgate through a certified letter, describe the employee dismissals as an internal restructuring, and allow the entire matter to decompose privately. That was Victoria's preferred outcome without Victoria in the room. More painfully, it was also the outcome the old Evelyn would have chosen. Instead, I stood in front of the two groups with the greatest power to damage our future. The bonding company could restrict our ability to bid. Westbridge could suspend or terminate projects. I turned on the projector. The first slide showed the empty steel shelf in Bay 12, covered in an unbroken gray layer of dust. The bay number was visible on the upright. "This shelf," I said, "is where $84,000 of copper fittings were documented as received and stored. The material was never there. I took this photograph more than 2 years ago, and today I can finally explain why I waited." I gave them everything. I described Northgate, the inflated prices, the phantom purchase orders, the $1.9 million, the 27 terminations, Colin's initials on receiving logs, Denise's role in suppressing internal review, and the outside fraud attorney, whose engagement letter my father had signed at 7:15 that morning. I spoke calmly, almost like a weather presenter, because the facts required no decoration. Then I lifted the cancellation notice. With approximately 24 hours remaining before automatic renewal, I signed the letter at the head of the table and handed it to Martin for delivery by certified mail, with return receipt requested. The Westbridge executives questioned us for an hour. The bonding representatives asked even harder questions. They wanted to know who had access, which controls had failed, whether project materials were affected, and whether other vendor relationships were compromised. We answered everything we could and identified what still required investigation. At the end, Westbridge's senior vice president closed his folder and delivered the sentence Sabrina had predicted. "We are pausing the Riverside expansion pending our own review." The pause lasted 90 days and placed approximately $1.4 million in revenue on a ventilator. My father flinched. I did not. Not because the loss was painless, but because I had already decided to pay it at 1 a.m, beside a cup of cold tea. I understood the exchange rate. Saying fraud aloud in a conference room costs more than whispering severance in a hallway. It also buys something silence cannot. A record that cannot be rearranged later. News travels quickly in a county where the same families sit on hospital boards, charity committees, and country club patios. Victoria's forecast became partly true within a week. A local newspaper framed the matter as an ugly divorce spilling into a family business. My name appeared near the beginning, and the word vindictive hovered between lines, even when it was not printed. Victoria had priced the wrong thing. I folded the paper and said to the empty room, "You were right about one part. Family takes care of family." That is exactly what I am doing. The next accounting happened at 90 days, and then again at 5 months. Westbridge returned. Their auditors spent 6 weeks inside our records. They found exactly what we had disclosed and nothing we had hidden. In the same conference room where we had exposed the scheme, Westbridge's senior vice president told my father that in 30 years he had never seen a contractor open its own wound in front of a client. He said the decision to do so was the only reason Westbridge remained. The bonding company renewed our program with additional controls and reporting conditions, all of which we were relieved to accept. The fraud case ended the way many real financial cases end, without handcuffs, television cameras, or a judge striking a gavel in a dramatic montage. Russell Mercer's attorneys negotiated a civil settlement. Approximately $1.1 million would be repaid over 4 years. Northgate, Industrial Supply, dissolved. The investigative file remained open, sitting in a drawer where everyone involved could continue feeling its presence. 2 of the 27 former employees filed wrongful termination lawsuits. Both claims collapsed under the conflict of interest forms I had required years earlier, back when Denise laughed about me reading warranty cards for pleasure. The forms did not prevent the scheme, but they prevented the participants from rewriting the policy after they were caught. Bennett Mechanical now operates with 189 employees. We are smaller, more disciplined, and governed by a procurement policy I designed to survive a siege. The Holloways, meanwhile, did not vanish in a flash of justice. That is another truth stories often avoid. There was no lightning bolt, Victoria continued chairing the hospital gala. Her social circle continued welcoming her. Somewhere in the county, she still remembers the names of powerful people's children and remains magnificent at making each person feel selected. Adrian became engaged again by Thanksgiving to a woman his mother introduced. I sincerely hope the reality is kinder to her than the brochure suggests. Their world continued turning. It simply stopped turning through us. That became the real prize. Not Victoria's ruin, not Adrian's humiliation, and not the fantasy of watching every person who doubted me apologize. The prize was a locked door, my hand on the key, and no welcome packet waiting on the other side. 5 months after the disclosure meeting, in November, Dad asked me to walk through the warehouse with him. Walking the floor has always been his love language. He stopped at bay 12 inches front of the third shelf. It was filled with copper fittings, real inventory connected to real job numbers, and purchased from a distributor Martin had verified 3 different ways. Dad looked at the shelf the way other people look at stained glass windows. "I fired family," he said at last. Then he added, "I should have listened to family." That was the complete apology. If you knew Harold Bennett, you would understand it was a cathedral. Then Dad offered me the presidency of Bennett Mechanical. He would remain chairman, keep his boots on the shop floor, and keep his hands away from the organizational chart. I accepted on one condition. Every future hire would pass through a 3-person review panel. No exceptions for friendships, marriages, favors, charity contacts, or last names. That included Bennett. It especially included Bennett. Dad laughed at first. When he realized I was serious, he shook my hand in the warehouse aisle with the solemnity of a man signing a contract. At the company picnic that autumn, I wore my new badge for the first time. It read, "Evelyn Bennett, President." I was a welder's daughter, standing beside a shelf the company could finally trust, wearing the name I was born with, the name no one had planted, and the name I had finally stopped apologizing for protecting with fine print. If I could carve one sentence above the door of every family, it would be this: keeping the peace is not the same as keeping the family. Sometimes, the loudest act of love is refusing to remain quiet. My story came down to an empty shelf in Bay 12, a welcome packet I once signed with pride, and a phone call made 9 minutes after a judge's signature freed my hands. For years, I believed protecting a family meant absorbing its conflict in silence. I know better now. Protecting a family sometimes means drawing the boundary everyone else was too frightened to draw, then refusing to apologize when that boundary finally holds. Taking care of yourself is part of taking care of the people who truly belong beside you.